Alrighty, Amulet students, let's talk about chapters 11 through 15. There's going to be a lot to talk about, so get ready for a decently long um, video here. Buckle your seatbelts. We're in for a ride. And the things I want to focus on are more of the thematic and symbolic elements, as well as other literary features that Hawthorne uses, like dialogue, description, narration, a lot of that, as well as limited point of view, using third person limited to show specific characters' thoughts as he really hones in on specific character development in these chapters. So I'll be looking a lot at literary features, and that's something you should be paying attention to as well. And there are going to be several questions that pertain to that on the quiz. So please be paying attention as you read. And that's one of the main reasons why I want you to read the text, because it gives you this depth of literature that you can never find in summaries and in other literary aids like SparkNotes. Okay, so let's talk about chapter 11 here. If I can move there, here we go. So chapter 11, we've talked about in class already, so I won't belabor it too much. But for the ones who are online, I will make a few comments where the chapter is titled The Interior of a Heart. And whose heart are we talking about? We're talking about Dimmesdale's. Now here Hawthorne is looking at a deeper look into Dimmesdale because up until this point we've had um, like implications that Dimmesdale was Pearl's father and committed the crime of adultery with Hester. In chapter 10, it became a little bit clearer. It became a little bit more explicit after Chillingworth saw something on Dimmesdale's chest. Um, and here we'll see a little bit more about what's going on within Dimmesdale. And what we see is it starts with Dimmesdale and Chillingworth continuing their relationship. And what's happening is Chillingworth is continuously getting into Dimmesdale's life deeper and deeper, so that if you look at paragraph 2 in chapter 11, Chillingworth became thenceforth not a spectator only, but a chief actor in the poor minister's interior world. And I love this metaphor that Hawthorne uses, that Chillingworth is now becoming the main actor, a main character, the chief proponent to Dimmesdale's deteriorating health, right? And what's happening is, if you continue reading here, Chillingworth is able to poke and prod into Dimmesdale's life to a way where Dimmesdale continues to deteriorate physically but also spiritually, and he's feeling the guilt and shame within him. And so in the next paragraph here as well, it's so subtle. This was accomplished with the subtlety so perfect that the minister, though he had a constantly a dim perception of some evil influence watching over him, he could never gain a knowledge of its actual nature. So Dimmesdale is aware that there's some kind of evil influence over his life that's causing him to feel this way, but he is unable to recognize that it's Chillingworth who's doing this to him. And so thereby we see two people actually becoming ruined in this. And this idea that Chillingworth is becoming ruined in this process will be explored a little bit deeper in the next few chapters. But then it really hones in on Dimmesdale. And you really see that Dimmesdale is achieving brilliant popularity in his sacred office, as you see in the next paragraph. And it was because of his sorrows, because of his emotion. Dimmesdale being tapped into his vulnerability and knowing just how corrupt he is, he knows his sin. He's able to share an emotion with the Puritan people that they have never seen in another minister. And it said here that other ministers were very intelligent, very smart, very well versed in the Bible, but they were kind of emotionless. And so people are gravitating towards Dimmesdale because of that human emotion within him. Um, And if you turn the page in one of the paragraph that starts not improbably, if you go to the middle of the paragraph, it says, they fancied him the mouthpiece of heaven's messages of wisdom, rebuke, and love. In their eyes, the very ground on which he trod was sanctified. And so the people are revering, they're venerating, they're adoring Dimsdale as the mouthpiece of heaven's messages of wisdom. He's like the messenger of God. But this, as says here in the next paragraph, the agony with which this public veneration tortured Dimsdale. It made Dimsdale feel even worse because it's really poking to the hypocrisy of his heart. And here, this characterization of Dimsdale is symbolic, and I hope you're adding to your symbolism chart. You can add that this inner guilt is an important theme that Hawthorne is developing, and Dimsdale represents that theme of inner guilt. This inner guilt that is unable to be released, that is manifested in physical illnesses. Um, and we're seeing here it's torturing him, and he wants to speak out some of these things, and as I mentioned this in class, but he wanted to say that to the people, hey, you guys look at me as this wonderful human being, but I'm an utterly a pollution and a lie. And in fact, he said this. He says that he was altogether vile, a viler companion of the vilest. And I love that progression of superlatives that Hawthorne uses. He says he was altogether vile, a viler companion of the vilest. I love that literary play on words that Hawthorne uses there. But he calls himself this terrible person, the worst of sinners, an abomination, a thing of unimaginable iniquity. And he says that if they could see his true inner being, he would just shrivel up and burn with the wrath of the Almighty. But that just makes people even more loving and venerating and adoring and revering and respecting of Dimsdale, because they're like, wow, this guy, the godly youth, they said among themselves, the saint on earth, alas, if he discerns such sinfulness in his own white soul, what horrid spectacle would he behold in thine or mine? However, the minister well knew, subtle but remorseful hypocrite that he was. And so he loathed his miserable self. And so what did he do because he loathed himself? It says here that he had in his closet a bloody scourge. And here's a picture on the bottom right of what a scourge looks like. It's a whip that's frayed with many talons and pieces of rope. And he would ply it. Ply means to use. He would ply it on his own shoulders. He would fast to the point where his knees trembled beneath him. He was fasting so rigorously that he was weak. He kept vigils night after night, meaning he was staying up all night trying to repent for his sins. And as a result, his brain often reeled and visions seemed to flit before him. He would see demons, angels. He even says here he saw his friends of his youth, his white bearded father. Then he sees at the end, in this weird kind of hallucinatory vision, Hester Prynne leading along with Pearl in her scarlet garden, pointing her forefinger first at the scarlet breast on her bosom and then at the clergyman's own breast. So in this chapter, there's hardly any dialogue and it's all narration, and Hawthorne is using that to create a specific tone, this tone of agony. And you'll see that in some chapters there's a bunch of dialogue, in some there's hardly any. Like, look at chapter 12 now. In chapter 12, it's kind of broken up into two parts. The first part is where Dimsdale goes up to the scaffold himself. And on the bottom left, here's a picture of that scaffold. And the scaffold, the reason why it's so symbolic of that guilt and shame and punishment is because no one goes on that scaffold except criminals or the one who is leading the criminal up to the scaffold. But the scaffold is reserved specifically for criminals, and so therefore it represents the punishment, sin, shame, guilt of the people. And here in the beginning of chapter 12, you can find some great quotes to show the scaffold. Like in my book, it's page 123, the second page of chapter 12. And he goes up to the scaffold and he cries out loud by himself. But keep in mind, it's a cloudy night, no one can see him, and he shrieks out loud, but for some reason, he thinks it's loud and it's going to wake the whole town, but it's like a feeble, probably because he's so weak, because he hasn't eaten, he hasn't slept, and he thinks, okay, it's done. Everyone's going to come, they're going to see me on the scaffold, and my secret will be exposed. But nobody thinks anything of it in this paragraph that starts, but it was not so. He thought, okay, it was done. They're going to find me here. It was not so. People just kind of thought it was a wild animal. People thought it was like Mistress Hibbins, who's Governor Bellingham's sister, thought it was just people in the forest doing their weird chants. And so he's up there and he's just kind of soaking it in and wanting to expose his sin. But then interestingly, he sees Reverend Mr. Wilson, who's like the head reverend of the town, if you recall from chapter 2. And he sees him leaving Governor Winthrop, who used to be a previous governor of the town. He sees him leaving his house because Governor Winthrop has passed away. And that's going to be an important event because there's so many people affected by this passing. We see that Chillingworth was there because he was ministering aid to Winthrop. Wilson obviously was there. Hester was on her way doing errands for that purpose. And so Dimsdale sees Wilson and he wants to say things. He wants to say a good evening to you, venerable Father Wilson. Come up hither, I pray you, and pass a pleasant hour with me. But he thinks he actually spoke it, but he didn't. It was only his imagination because Father Wilson just continues walking by. And as he continue, we then see Hester and Pearl come through. Wait, before that, actually, there's a really, really important paragraph here. The paragraph that starts shortly afterwards, the like grisly sense of the humorous again stole in among the solemn phantoms of his thoughts. In this paragraph, there's this tone, this very light tone of the whole neighborhood beginning to awaken. And it starts with this sentence: the neighborhood would begin to rouse itself. And there's just so many lines of narration of the different people who would be waking up. And I feel like that's really symbolic because Hawthorne is trying to show that people are beginning to wake up to a truth, a reality, a very important thing that's going on in the town. And that's that there's a lot of evil and sin, or evil and sin in the Puritan way, but just human nature, kind of. And so then Dimsdale sees Hester and Pearl, and he calls out, he says, Pearl, little Pearl. Hester, Hester Prynne, are you there? And Hester and Pearl are like, huh? Yeah. And Dimsdale invites Pearl and Hester to come up. And so you can see that picture on the left with all three of them together on the scaffold. They're up there, and Pearl asks Dimsdale, will you stand here with my mother and me tomorrow noontide? Because she wants to know if Dimsdale's going to if he reveal that he is her father. But he says, no, I can't. I cannot. And he says, the only time I'm going to be standing here in front of other people is at the great judgment day. So he's kind of resolved it in his mind that he will not let the secret come out. And that's going to be important because you see this moment of family. They're family. And Hester and Dimsdale, they care for each other. And Dimsdale wants to be there in the family. He wants to be with Pearl, his daughter, but he can't. and they all desperately want that, but he just can't. He just cannot. And interestingly, then a meteor appears in the sky, and it blazes in such a way where it looks like an A. An A. And the townspeople of the town, or townspeople at the time, viewed meteors, especially one that looks like an A, as some kind of symbol, and that they would interpret it. It says here that nothing was more common in those days than to interpret all meteoric appearances. And keep that in mind, because there's going to be some different interpretations of the letter A that appeared. And then Roger Chillingworth comes by, and uh, Dimsdale wants to know. He says, "Who is that man, Hester?" And so his spidey senses are tingling. He's starting to realize that there is something off about Chillingworth. And so he asks, "Hey, Hester, do you know this man?" But she remembered her oath and was silent. So she's keeping her secret with Chillingworth. And he she does that, but she's starting to see, and you'll see in the next chapter, that her keeping that secret is actually not a good thing, and she's recognizing the effect that Chillingworth is having on him, on Dimsdale. And then the chapter ends with Dimsdale preaching this great, the best sermon that they've ever heard from him before. And someone brings his black glove to him and says he found it at the scaffold. And what does he say? He says, "Satan dropped it there. I take it." And so the the theme of seeing Dimsdale as a hero, as a revered person, continues. Okay. And then chapter 13 is titled "Another View of Hester," and the story shifts back to Hester and her kind of redemptive story. And it starts off with her recognizing, it says here, that she was shocked at the condition to which she found the clergyman reduced. And she's starting to realize that a terrible machinery had been brought to bear. And the person operating that machinery was Chillingworth, destroying Dimsdale's soul. And we also see that 7 years have passed. Pearl is 7, it says here, and Hester has changed. And the view of Hester in society has changed. And Hawthorne kind of gives redemption not just to Hester, but to the people of the town. He says that the town loves more readily than it hates. It's part of human nature to eventually forgive. Um, and so that's what they're doing. Hester is becoming an important part of town. It says that she was ready to give of her little substance to every demand of poverty. And so she's doing her part to give to charity. She's helping the poor. She's helping other people. And even the A is starting to change in people's minds. It's becoming like a soft token um, of a pillow for the head that needed one to rest on. And so the view of her in town is changing, and people are interpreting the A now not as adultery, but they're saying that it meant able. It now means able, that she is able. And it's causing her to develop into this wonderful woman who is able to affect change and help help bring good to the people. And interestingly, she kind of dulls herself. She's no longer looking beautiful. And the paragraph that says the effect of the symbol, or rather of the position and respect to society that it indicated by it, on the mind of Hester Prynne herself was powerful and peculiar. We see that in this paragraph, Hawthorne goes on to describe that her beauty is becoming muted. Her hair, which is often a symbol of women's beauty, is being tied up in this cap, and that she's kind of hiding her beauty and no longer looking beautiful. And instead, she's becoming kind of this motherly, matronly, affectionate person in town. And in fact, in that same paragraph that I mentioned, he says that nothing in Hester's bosom to make it ever again the pillow of affection. And I think he's using that intentionally there to show that he's not really worthy anymore. She's not worthy of that kind of romantic view, and she's like a woman who's hardy and not really in the prime of her life anymore. And she's kind of becoming cold herself in terms of like not really being emotional in life. And she's kind of almost rising above humanity. And it says here in this particular paragraph, the world's law was no law for her mind. She's kind of rising above it. And there's another reference, an allusion to Anne Hutchinson. And this picture on the bottom right is Anne Hutchinson, a Puritan who kind of went against church teaching. And Hawthorne again is attributing this to her because Anne Hutchinson brought a lot of reform to the church and brought a lot of important claims against the church that caused them to change their ideas. And Hester is kind of seen like that figure too. She's bringing about change in the way that people view sinners and people who have committed these crimes. And she then decides at the end to meet her former husband, that she is realizing that he's having too much an effect on Dimmesdale, so she wants to confront her husband. And that's exactly what she does in chapter 14, which is titled Hester and the Physician. And it starts first with this very interesting foreshadow in the first paragraph, where Hester kind of leaves Pearl to go off and run at the this little brook, this little stream, and she goes into the stream and starts talking to it, and starts talking to the nature. And we'll see this very important theme develop, especially in the next chapter, of Pearl's tie with nature and what that means for the story. So it's a little bit of a foreshadow, so keep that in mind, because then it moves straight into Hester and um, Chillingworth's conversation. And so they talk, and Chillingworth starts off with, "Hey, I heard in town that it was debated whether or no, with safety of the common weal, yonder Scarlet Letter might be taken off your bosom. On my life, Hester, I made my entreaty to the worshipful magistrate that it might be done forthwith." So he's saying people are talking about taking that Scarlet Letter off your chest. And I vouched for you. I said, hey, it'd be a good idea. But interestingly, you would think that someone who had to wear this badge of shame would want to get rid of it, right? But here's what she says: "Were I worthy to be quit of it, it would fall away of its own nature or be transformed into something that should speak a different purport." So she's saying, no, it's not ready for me to take it off because it's not the time. And in fact, in the previous chapter, she said that it had not finished its job. There's still something to be done with it. And as she's talking, she's recognizing that Chillingworth is changed. Even though it's been 7 years, and yeah, people change a lot in 7 years. I mean, if you see me in my picture of 7 years ago, very different. But he's changed a lot. And it's not that he looks any like worse or he's deteriorated. It's not the same kind of change that Dimmesdale's experiencing, because Dimmesdale is growing paler, he's growing thinner, but Chillingworth is looking more evil. And it says here, Hester had been looking steadily at the old man and was shocked as well as wonder smitten to discern what a change had been wrought upon him within the past 7 years. And it's not that he aged or he looks disgusting or like Dimmesdale, but um, it says that the former aspect of an intellectual and studious man, so he used to look like a scholar, calm and quiet, which was what she best remembered in him, had almost altogether vanished. So he no longer looks like that. And been succeeded by an eager, almost searching, almost fierce, yet carefully guarded look. And in fact, it says that there was a glare of red light out of his eyes. kind of symbolic of the evil nature, this desire for revenge. And it says here, in a word, old Roger Chillingworth was a striking evidence of man's faculty of transforming himself into a devil. And so he's letting that revenge take over him. Remember that symbolic element of Chillingworth. He represents what evil comes into a man when he solely desires revenge. And so he's changing. And so, like I said earlier in this video, like what feels like many years ago, that Dimmesdale and Chillingworth are becoming destroyed by this secret. Dimmesdale, obviously, he's killing himself. The guilt is tormenting him, and Chillingworth also, his desire for revenge is destroying him. And so she's saying, you need to stop doing this to him. You're tormenting him. Your clutch is on his life, and you cause him to die daily a living death, and still he knows you not. In permitting this, I have surely acted a false part by the only man to whom the power has left me to be true. So she's recognizing her fault in keeping that secret. And and Chillingworth and Hester says, better he have died at once. He's like, instead of the slow, torturous 7-year death, you should have just killed him. And Chillingworth has this important dialogue. He says, yea, woman, thou sayest truly, better had he died at once. Never did mortal suffer what this man had suffered, and all in the sight of his worst enemy. And so he's like, yeah, obviously, but there was more evil that had to be done, and he needed to find out. And he's saying here in this is that there was this poison. He calls it this perpetual poison of the direst revenge. And so he kept doing it because of his personal vendetta. And she sees the transformation of his hideous whoreness transformed here. And yeah, it ends with more continued dialogue, but just how evil Chillingworth has become. And so finally we get to chapter 15, which is titled Hester and Pearl. And it starts off with Chillingworth leaving and Hester just showing so much hatred. And, chapter 14 was filled with all this dialogue between Chillingworth and Hester. And you really, the dialogue makes it so much more intimate. And it's broken up with the narration that Hawthorne uses. And the narration is supposed to be much more introspective and try to help you think deeper about the themes and symbolism, whereas the dialogue is really to make it more intimate. And so chapter 15 goes back to the style of narration as we see the evilness and deformity of Chillingworth leave, and Hester says, I hate him. Says it again, repeats it. And we know repetition is important in literature, right? Yes, I hate him. We recognize just how much she can see the evil in him. And we see Pearl come back. Hester looks for Pearl, and we see this intimate relationship with nature that Pearl has. It says here that at first, if you look about 2 pages into the chapter, at first, as already told, she had flirted fancifully with her own image in a pool of water, beckoning the phantom forth, and as it declined to venture, seeking a passage for herself into its sphere of impalpable earth and attainable sky. Soon finding, however, that either she or the image was unreal, she turned elsewhere for better pastime. And look at how she deals with nature. She made little boats out of birch bark and freighted them with snail shells, and sent out more ventures on the mighty deep than any merchant in New England, but the larger part of them foundered near the shore. And on. This whole chapter talks about what she did with nature. She's just interacting, and she's very free spirit. She's just very innocent, and it's really symbolic of just the carefree nature of humanity and just the kind of freedom that we all desire. You see, the other characters are tied down by some kind of sin, some kind of weight. Dimmesdale with his guilt, Chillingworth with his desire for revenge, Hester with her sin and the actual physical Scarlet Letter on her. But Pearl is just free. She's just free. She's just kind of chilling on with nature. And then she really interestingly in this paragraph, look for the paragraph that says her final employment was to gather seaweed. So she goes by the brook, the stream. Um, there's seaweed around. She gets some, and what she does is she took some eelgrass and imitated as best she could on her own bosom the decoration with which she was so familiar on her mother's, a letter, the letter A, but freshly green instead of scarlet. And that's an important color distinction because it doesn't quite show that she has that corrupt sin in her. It's just green, it's not red. And so that I like this little picture that I found of her with some seaweed on her chest and her head too, apparently, in the shape of an A. And that really continues to solidify that connection that Pearl has with the Scarlet Letter and the fact that they're inseparable and that wherever she is, the Scarlet Letter is as well. And so Hester sees that and is like, you know what that is? And she's like, "No, tell me." And she continues to ask this, and Hester is realizing that her daughter is so precocious, which we talked about just means ahead of her time, really smart for her age. And she is just so keen and aware of what's going on because Pearl just keeps asking all throughout this chapter, and it even ends with her asking Hester, she says, "Mother, what does Scarlet Letter mean?" And it's interesting because up until this time, Hester had never shied away from it. She had never before been false to the symbol of her bosom, but this time she isn't able to explain what the Scarlet Letter is. And it's almost like she doesn't have to because Pearl is the embodiment. She's a manifestation of the Scarlet Letter. But Pearl doesn't quite know that and keeps asking it. And the chapter ends with them running into Dimsdale. Ooh, and we'll see what happens as we continue reading. But again, like I said, please pay attention to those literary features and the way Hawthorne develops the story with the characters, themes, symbols, metaphors, allusions, similes, imagery, um, and yeah, just take it all in. Just read it and just see how masterfully he crafted this story.